I want to welcome to another High Noon program. We have a very special program coinciding with our American Indian Boarding School Stories exhibit. My name is Kevin Cloister, I'm the museum director. I have a couple announcements. Next month, Thursday, May 16, Lauren Huntley, our own community historian, has a program called Photographs and Football, The Dual Lives of Frank Shively and Alexander Upshaw. You might even hear those names potentially today with Janine's talk.
Hopefully the person will stand here.
She's going to be doing a program on the dark skies, which has become a big push, especially in southeastern Montana, where there's a lot of distance and darkness. Local communities actually have expressed a lot of interest in protecting the night sky. We're one of the few states left that can see the lights at night. It's hard to believe, isn't it? So if you go to New Jersey, they don't really see the night sky like we still have that opportunity. So, and that'll be in July. So, and we do have all that material up front. I also invite you, obviously, to go into the American Indian Boarding School exhibit, and also downstairs we have a new traveling exhibit. The Western Heritage Center now has more traveling exhibits than any other museum in the state, and we provide those at low cost. We have, I think, a show up in Chinook right now. There's one of our traveling exhibits is in Lewistown, and so we have the new one, which is on the great photographer Richard Throssell, a Cree Indian photographer who was adopted by the Crow and was photographing contemporary with Edward Curtis. His photographs have a more personal touch. We actually love it. I love the photo of somebody jumping into the Little Bighorn, and all you see is their legs sticking out of the water. So very unusual take. So we're privileged today to have Dr. Janine Pease with us. Dr. Pease actually was at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania last week doing further research, so we're getting first dibs, I guess, on understanding her new work. So she's been working with the Archives and Special Collections at the Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. In addition, she has been conducting research in the Little Bighorn. Is that me? I'm always afraid. It's the same tone as mine. So, Dr. Pease has been conducting research in the Little Bighorn College archives and the former student lives after returning home from Carlisle. Dr. Pease is the founding president of the Little Bighorn College of the Crow Nation from 1983 to 2000. She is presently on the Little Bighorn College faculty of the Crow Oral History Project, studying the 1950s to the 1970s Crow Indian experience to the present. Without further ado, Dr. Janine Pease.
Well, thank you, Kevin Cloister. It's an honor to be here in the Western Heritage Center and to see all of you renew some friendships. It's a great honor to take the opportunity to make this presentation. And I have to tell you that I am the age that the people you'll see in the pictures at Carlisle are my grandparents' age. It's not that far a reach, and some of you may actually have relatives who did attend Carlisle. So there are, I think, the connections. When we are looking at history, we want, I think, to see if we can go there to understand the voices, the narrative, and the stories. And that's what I'm anxious to do. As a scholar and an historian, I'm very interested in the narratives of children and women. And I've been an educator all of my career, so following schools and colleges has been, well, in the operation of them, but now in the history of them. And so understanding the Catholic boarding schools, the BIA boarding schools, and the off-reservation boarding schools is one of my areas I'm very fascinated by it. My grandchildren say, how can you continue to want to know this? You know, it's gone on for years. Well, I guess that's the mark of the historian, that curiosity goes beyond. So I have put together very much of a photo essay, but also the research that I have been privileged to perform. Dickinson College is in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They are the archives for the Carlisle Indian School records, and it is a very accessible digital resource center. So I've done most of my research just in my living room out there in the Heights or when I lived in Hardin. But I recently did spend several days right there in the archives, and I was able to look around the campus and also become, I think, come in closer contact with some information I simply couldn't at this distance. So I'd like to begin my presentation. Two parts, really. First, let's understand what Carlisle Indian School is, or was in the 40 years that it operated, where it came from, and then also to visit the Crow Indian students who attended there and some of their lives in a profile when they returned to the reservation. And please don't watch me, it's up there on the screen. Even though I am beautiful. So, let me just mention. I'm sorry?
The fat part goes in your palm.
Okay. All right. So I've had a lot of help, as any historian does in doing research. Tim Bernardus, who is the director of the library at Little Bighorn, John Ely, the director of the archives, and Jim Garenser is the director of the archives at Dickinson College, and where all of the records of Carlisle School is, as well as Frederick Hoxie, who has written the definitive history of the Crow people, parading through history, as well as Mardell Hogan Plainfeather. And I'd just like to say to you that there are actually two children of Carlisle graduates living today. Carl Pease, who lives out not too far from Billings, and Mardell lives over in the Heights. And they have been able to share lots of memories of their parents and their recounting of their time at Carlisle. This is a photo of Captain Pratt, whose design Carlisle is. Captain Pratt was in the Civil War, and he then also, after the Civil War, went out to the end of the Indian Wars in the Southwest. He was in some of the really tough battles. So let's just take a look at what's up here. Captain Pratt spent 3 years at Fort Marion, which is a prison in Florida. And his assignment was to look after all these prisoners of war: Apache, Kiowa, Caddo, Cheyenne, Comanche. In a makeshift fortress, he looked after them, and after an interaction with them over a period of years, he realized these were educable human beings. He managed to organize a tutor for them, and quite a number of them just jumped out there in literacy. They could read and write in no time, and he also found that they were considerably talented artistically. Well, it came as quite a surprise to him. If you ever have a chance to read his journals, he journaled every single day and thought the greatest of his own writing. But at any rate, he did decide to take 22 of these prisoners of war to Hampton. Hampton is an institute for the children of freed blacks after the Civil War, Hampton Institute. So they had a dorm reserved for Native students, and there are some tribes in the Northern Plains that have sent quite a few children to Hampton. My own great-grandmother went to Hampton and finished what would be considered a college education at the time. Her name was Sarah Walker Pease. But Hampton, well, when he got there, he didn't really like it. He wasn't really happy with the potential, what he looked at as potential mixing of races. He didn't care for their entire approach, and he also wanted to be in charge. He was rather a control freak in a lot of ways. He wrote a petition to Congress that we should have a school, especially for Indian children, but also the prisoners. And within a year's time, the Congress managed to appropriate funds and open this Army facility for an Indian school. It's like a miracle, you know, who does anything with Congress inside 1 year? But here is Captain Pratt holding his well, he's just in parade and then on his steed. Captain Pratt. And I have, as all of you are probably historians, you love to read. Well, I've read quite a bit about Carlisle, but this Jacqueline Fear-Segal is someone who's worked in the Cumberland Historical Society, which is right in Carlisle for many years, most of her career. So she's an expert on Carlisle. Now, this is part of one of the speeches that he made. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Carlisle has always planted reason to the tribe and loyalty to the nation at large. It has preached against colonizing Indians and in favor of individualizing them. Keyword, individualize. You will probably know that Native people are very community and kin bound in their traditions and their ways of life. But he was very interested in individualizing the students and in favor of individualizing them. It has demanded for them the same multiplicity of changes which all others in the country enjoy. His idea was that give me 3 to 5 years of these children, I will make them into mainstream citizens. And his slogan was, kill the Indian, save the boy. He said it frequently. It was even on a sign right there in the school. Carlisle does not dictate to him what line of life he should fill, so it is an honest one. It says to him that if he gets the living by the sweat of the brow and demonstrates to the nation that he is a man, he does more good for his race than hundreds of his fellows who cling to the tribal communistic surroundings. He proposed this school as a good alternative to warring on the tribes, that it was less expensive, but it was war nonetheless. And we'll learn just exactly the ways in which the war was waged on the children who attended. This is a portrayal, an annual photo. Oftentimes Carlisle had up to 1,000 students. You'll notice the youngest children are in the front. And one of the most striking things about this photo is that every child looks like every other child. They were dressed in a military uniform. They were issued certain, like 2 sets, 2 uniforms, both girls and boys. They looked exactly identical to one another. The older students are in the back, and we see even some staff in the back. All 140 tribes, 10,800 children attended this school over the 40 years of its experience. And Carlisle Industrial School is written by Fear-Segal, Jacqueline Fear-Segal, I mentioned her before. The Indian children traveled 2,000 miles. When they were chosen by their agents, they were put on train or riverboat or whatever form of transportation, of course, probably wagons, and off they went. They were chosen for various reasons. Some agents like to send students with lots of potential, or they sent troublemakers. It could vary, and some agents never sent anyone at all. Captain Pratt determined to remove the Native children as far as possible from their families and communities, to strip them of all aspects of their traditional cultures. And this means all: no singing, no speaking the language, no carrying any kind of special icon or symbol, no clothing of any whisper of the past of who they had been. Nothing was left of even their names. We'll get to the names. Carlisle was the first off-reservation Indian boarding school. So he laid down the print, and then 24 more off-reservation schools were made in various locations around the United States, most far from Indian country. This is just to illustrate, we all know how far it is to Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, and for the Crow students, they would go from that first star all the way over to the other one. Children were taken often directly from their families. In the case of the Crow boarding school, they were taken from the boarding school to the train, then off they went to Carlisle. Actually most of the students in Carlisle were a bit older. They weren't as young as the very youngest that you saw in that photo, but maybe 12 years and older. So they'd already been in a boarding school. All right. This is an Army barracks facility. Okay, only 758 of the 10,600 Indian students graduated. This is a high school academic education at that time. So just that number of the 10,800, and it speaks to those who might have been at grades level earlier or lower. So it also speaks, those who graduated probably entered at grade 6 or grade 7, and they did give them tests for placement. Over the 40 years of school existence, there were changes in program elements due to most students returning home. Now Pratt decided his approach was that if you came to this school over 3 or 5 years, you'd become a white person and go off into mainstream society and never look back. But in fact, the Native students chose going home. A very huge majority chose to return home. And then the change came about, the emphasis changed to teaching skills to make Indians self-sufficient at home and able to live on the reservations rather than assimilated into the mainstream society. So they had vocations. They also, in the second half of Carlisle, they had native arts, oratory, and literary societies and sports. The school was easily accessible to national leaders. So 4 or 5 times a year, congressional leaders, senators, even a president came to visit Carlisle. So another book on boarding schools is Education for Extinction by David Wallace Adams, an indigenous author. And he has an alphabetical listing by tribe. Of course, these are the Cs because Crow is among the Cs. And when I show this, other tribes say, but what about another page? Well, get the book and look. And I didn't memorize, but I will say, over there in the gold, 97 Crow Indian students, children and youth, attended Carlisle. But you can also see Chippewa, 998, Choctaw, 82, Coos Bay, 4, Coeur d'Alene, 4, Cree, 1, Creek, 104, and so on. Quite a mix of tribal nations represented there. There are not many recorded narratives by students who attended Carlisle. Luther Standing Bear is one of them, and he wrote this. Luther Standing Bear learned from Long Chin. The whites had come to collect children for school in the East. He was told to bring his father to sign for him, and Luther decided he wanted to go. When I went to the East, to Carlisle, I went there thinking I would die. I could think of white people wanting little Lakota children for no other reason than to kill them. But I thought, here is my chance to prove that I can die bravely. So I went east to show my father and my people that I was brave and willing to die for them. Imagine a child thinking that. And he wrote about this after he had been to Carlisle. He became quite a writer. Standing Bear, a Dakota, he says, the fact is that we were to be transformed, and short hair being the mark of gentility with the white man, he put upon us the mark. It hurt my feelings to such an extent that the tears came into my eyes. None of us slept well that night. We felt so queer. I wanted to feel my head all the time, Standing Bear said. The night before the hair cutting, there was almost a revolt. Cutting off of hair was associated with mourning, the loss of loved ones. An older boy at Carlisle cut his own hair, and the girls and boys began a shrill wailing, an eerie, unsettling wailing. Another voice from boarding schools, this is Zitka Sa. She was at a Quaker boarding school, not at Carlisle, but she wrote about the experience. Sitka Sa Yankton Lakota attended a Quaker boarding school at age 12. On the first day, a large bell rang for breakfast, its loud metallic voice crashing through the belfry overhead and into our sensitive ears. The annoying clatter of shoes on bare floors gave us no peace. The constant clash of harsh noises with an undercurrent of many voices measuring in an unknown tongue made a bedlam within which I was security tied. And though in spirit tore itself in struggling for its lost freedom, all was useless. I want to suggest to you to think about being in a place where you are suddenly unable to communicate with anyone, nor hear anything that they might say. So you have duct tape over your mouth and your ears, and everything that you see, and if you could hear, is utterly and completely foreign and brutal. This is what she's expressing here. Once, she said, I lost a dear classmate. Now, epidemics are something that already Native students, children, have witnessed on their home reservations, but now we're talking about it at school. She says, once, I lost a dear classmate. I remember well how she used to mope along at my side until one morning she could not raise her head from her pillow. At her deathbed, I stood weeping as the pale-faced woman sat near her, moistening her dry lips. And this is from her memoirs. Now, Zitka Sa was a remarkably talented violinist, to the extent that she was hired by an Ivy League college to teach violin. But she started in a Quaker boarding school. She eventually did come to Carlisle as a teacher in music. So there were three types of boarding schools that BIA had locally. There was a boarding school. So Crow Agency and Pryor had boarding schools. And virtually every reservation in Montana had its own local boarding school where the children were mandated to go, rounded up by the tribal police every fall and taken there. And often they had to stay until Christmas or until the year was over. And so that was one tier, and that was grades 1 through 6. There were also some off-reservation 1 through 6 boarding schools here and there. Altogether in the United States, with the Boarding School Health and Healing Commission now has counted over 550 boarding schools run by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and churches. That's a lot of schools. Okay, now the high school, that's where these off-reservation boarding schools come in. Carlisle was an academic high school and vocational training place, but there were 25 others. So you kind of have to think of it as a 3-tier system. How did students get recruited to Carlisle? That's a real riddle. With some exceptions, it was older students who went off to off-reservation boarding schools. The BIA would canvass students on a regional basis, but the reservation agent, the person in charge at the reservation agent, or we now call them the superintendent, it was entirely his prerogative who was sent, or whether he sent any at all. In 1893, there was a standard made for parental consent, but before that, from 79 to 93, children were sent regardless of parental consent. Education was compulsory, no exceptions. Children were rounded up and taken from their parents to either the local boarding school or sent to maybe the Catholic boarding school or the off-reservation boarding school. Funding was based on treaty agreements. In other words, some of the funding was actually tribal money, but a lot of times then it was BIA money from the local agency, or Carlisle would send money to pay for the bringing students to Carlisle. Schools and agencies funded students' attendance sometimes together, and most advanced students were sent to, if you were advanced, that was the student they wanted to send to the off-reservation boarding school. But there are some agents who would send the troublemakers. There are some agents who would send the cream of the crop, and there are other agents who would send none at all. None at all. Interesting. Regulation dress, we saw in that very first slide, the entire student body, all in military dress. So yes, this is a military school, make no mistake about it. They never walked across the campus except in platoons. They marched the students from the dormitory to the cafeteria, from the cafeteria to the classroom. They were assigned to a platoon. They never waltzed across the campus, no, not at all. So changing from tribal clothing, that was taken and destroyed. Individuality was stripped away. They looked exactly like one another, carbon copies. Uniforms met school regulations. Boys had 2 plain suits, an extra pair of trousers. Girls had 3 dresses. The off-reservation schools actually had better clothing. My own grandfather went to the BIA boarding school in Crow Agency, and he said he spent his entire childhood in wool underwear and wool uniforms, no matter what the temperature was. He was constantly in rashes and scratching himself, which he'd get in trouble for. It was very uncomfortable. Reservation school children often had oversized boots and beaten up hats. When you see those pictures, you'll see the difference. And after the civilized man. So the before and after, and it was something of a propaganda program. We'll look at photographs a little later in the program here. Names for Indian children. The boarding schools had an effort at all levels, all boarding schools, to name or rename the Indian children, to give them names. So let's see what this has to say. Some of the names were translated from the original name. So we have young man afraid of his horses, might be the surname. Translating the original name as a surname, there was a fellow who came to Carlisle from Crow. His name was Big Hale. That was his Indian name. But he took the name Egbert Hale while he was at school. And this fellow, Ernest Iron, his father was named the Iron, so he took Iron for his surname. Giving them completely new names from indigenous words, translating their name into 1 or 2 of the words from their name. Choosing common white names, lots of Smiths and Jones. And then there's several agencies, like I think there's the youths, they just had the students select first names only, so there's whole families with the last name of Jim, or Joe, or George. And then famous historical characters, Julius Caesar, George Washington, George S. Bull Washington. Indian agents were instructed to move with the renaming process. Now this might seem like so much administration. We'll just name it. But there are accounts of students asked to choose a name from a whole list on a chalkboard and given a pointing stick. When they're not literate, they don't know the names, they can't read, so they just go and point. And then they get given a name. Quite an antithesis to the naming process of Native people, however. N. Scott Momaday says that our names, we come from them, like water comes from the river, and it's the process that carries us through life. So this renaming is yet one more aspect of taking away, stripping away. Meals were a part of the civilizing experience. When children went to eat at Carlisle or any of the boarding schools, they were given whatever food they were served, and rules were made and enforced. No seconds. Conditions varied greatly in the amount and quality of the food. Carlisle had army rations, which was a bigger portion. rituals and rites at the table, like prayer, how to pass things, and so on. The outing system. In the summertime, Carlisle placed the Carlisle students with families in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and New York as an on-the-job training kind of education. As well, they got a nominal wage, which was put on account for them for their use at Carlisle. A grand majority of the students were placed in Quaker homes in Pennsylvania. So, Carlisle students lived and worked in outing placements in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Maryland. Students whose outing placements occurred during the school term, if they did, and occasionally about some, maybe 10% of the students were out there during the school year. They went to public school in New Jersey or in Pennsylvania. Well, that's amazing. Outing placement families paid a nominal wage to the Carlisle students for their work hours, and the funds were kept on account at the school. So the students all had some spending money of some sort from their outing, but they also had employment at the school. Carlisle students had to speak English. They had to hold jobs, that is, wherever they went, they were placed on outings, hold jobs to earn money while they were on outing placements. So Pratt and the teachers' goal was to prepare American Indian students to work in mainstream America. They studied English, math, geography, and music, and boys had industrial skills that were appropriate to the industry at the time. Furniture building, woodworking, working with iron, steel, and tin, and girls, home skills of cooking, doing the laundry, baking, and caretaking skills. Carlisle intercollegiate activities, especially in the last 20 years of the school, they had the students had sports teams that competed against Yale, Princeton, and Harvard. And so I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of Jim Thorpe, the 1912 Olympian who won in 2 areas. And there's also several runners, altogether 6 Olympians from Carlisle in their sports program, but also the football team, beat Harvard. Yeah, and they played, they were tremendous, really strong football force. But there were debate clubs and literary societies. And a number of the Crow students were in these debate clubs and literary societies. And they were good at writing letters and making speeches. Very, very skilled. Marching band. These off-reservation boarding schools were really big on music. My grandfather went to Sherman Institute and came back playing the piano, the trumpet, and the saxophone. And he absolutely adored music. It was in his system, but he learned it at Sherman Institute. Carlisle had a band, and the band actually marched in presidential inaugurations and performed. So, there was a change in leadership. Pratt got really despondent that the students were going home, but there was a thought in the progressives in the United States that it was time for the curriculum to really change. And so there was a new director of education named Estelle Real, and she said, cultivation of good habits, self-control, application, and responsiveness are recognized as being on a higher education plane than knowledge and definition. History of tribes and race are key. That's just the antithesis, and Pratt was so furious. I think he probably died of a heart attack after he realized they were going to change the direction. Teachers should rouse in the pupils an interest in the upward struggles of their people in the past and a determination to do their part toward the progress of their race in the future. It's like the first 20 years they went this way, and then the second 20 years they went this way. Amazing. So opportunities in intercollegiate competition, I've already talked about that. Native arts, debating societies. The Francis Loop Art Studio was opened in 1906 in decorative art, line and color, an emphasis on arts and crafts. And Angela Decora was a native person herself from Wisconsin, hired to instruct these courses. Football and other sports promoted student empowerment and launched Carlisle onto the national stage the greatest attention. In 1910 to 13, when James Thorpe joined the Carlisle football team. In 1911, Carlisle beat Harvard, and in the 1912 Olympic Games, Jim Thorpe won gold medals. I think it's not decathlon. And Louis Tewanima, a Hopi, won a silver medal in the 10,000 meter run. Carlisle struggled terribly with illness and death. And it is one of the criticisms, one of the factual data points about Carlisle is that illness was everywhere. About 50% of the students actually tested positive for TB. And Carlisle built a hospital specifically for the treatment of tuberculosis. Using archival material, government reports, newspapers, personal accounts, McBride, the author of Boarding Schools Rethinking Mortalities at Carlisle Indian School, that's her, Preston McBride. McBride quantifies Carlisle's demographic impact on its students. Enrollment, desertion, sickness, and mortality figures indicate that Carlisle exhibited extremely high death rates in comparison with other comparable demographic units. Then we have a couple more slides on that too. Diseases such as measles, mumps, trachoma, tuberculosis, and pneumonia ravaged the student population, devastating their immune system. And historian Barbara Landis, who actually works and lives in Carlisle, documents 192 deaths at Carlisle. Genevieve Bell asserts 227 perished as a result of attending Carlisle and the hospital that was built with an emphasis on tuberculosis. And the photographer you expect to feature that took so many pictures of Crow, well, the doctor at the tuberculosis hospital wanted a photographer to take pictures of Indians who did things in a sanitary manner, and he chose that person. Tell me the name. Throssell, Richard Throssell, who was a BIA clerk at Crow Agency. Well, there's so many connections. It's a conspiracy. All right, so here are photos of the classrooms. I know you're looking straight up in the air. It's kind of like stargazing. So a classroom at Carlisle in the upper left, and on the board it says current events. This is from the Cumberland County Historical Society. Carlisle has a marvelous photo archives in this county historical archives. And then on the right, a classroom at Carlisle Indian School in 1901. So they had a half a day of academics and a half a day of vocations. And here's some more, upper left is the dining hall, and then on the right, Carlisle Indian harness making shop. Carlisle Indian School sewing shop on the lower left, and a baking classroom. Here is all the buildings. This is an enormous campus. You know, it is a huge Army facility. So all of those little darkened, and I apologize, it's really difficult to know how to put this. I would thought maybe cut it in 4 and exaggerate it, but let me just read here. Carlisle Barracks was in good condition when the school opened, and students lived on the north end of the campus. Teachers and staff and superintendent lived on the south, and a large green space or quadrangle separated the grounds from the north and the south. Students and teachers moved across the center of the campus while using crisscrossing through footpaths. And there was a bandstand and a stone guardhouse. Now, I recently visited the campus, and one of the most amazing facilities and really horrifying was the guardhouse, because students who committed any infractions of any rules in this military school spoke their language or hummed a tune that was from a tribal, they were sent to the guardhouse. And it is a stone guardhouse. It's really a somber place. In the early 1880s, the students and the white staff expanded the school campus. They built a chapel, 3-story dining hall, classroom building, girls' dormitory, warehouse, boiler house, laundry, hospital, printing shop, art studio, and a cemetery. This is a huge place, 1,000 students at a time in all these buildings. So a few more scenes, the C for Carlisle. A main gate to Carlisle Indian School on the lower left. Here are the vocational buildings on the lower right. And this is a girls' dormitory with the students in military formation ready to go somewhere. I apologize. Whoops, there goes the band. Excuse me, take a break. Hopefully you're sitting far enough from me that you're not gathering my germs. Okay. Well, it's green grass and even some leaves in Carlisle right now. I took these pictures last week, and it was kind of like weird to go from our winter where we'd had just 4 inches of the ickiest slush to this. But there's the jail on the upper left. Okay. Now, so the students built a gymnasium, and those Olympians trained in this very gymnasium, and it's still being used by the Army. Thorpe Hall, built by the Carlisle students. And I actually stood on this balcony and took this picture. I really felt like I was on hallowed ground in Indian communities. You know, Thorpe is really somebody. We talk about that. Yeah, James Thorpe. So there's also quite a display, but ironically, it's inside the jail. So I guess we distract from all of this. We have posters to the Olympians, but then there are the jail cells. Carlisle Indian School Cemetery. This is 1935, and the cemetery has been moved twice. Now, if any of you are curious, and some of you may descend from Carlisle students, this is what the Resource Center looks like, and you can go there and enter a name. Names are problematic. You might find out that your relative used a name you never heard of before, and yet you might find a birth date that matches up. You might find someone from a district and realize that's your relative. So names are a bit problematic, but I encourage you to go further. You can also make a list of all the people who went there from your tribal nation. It will come in by date of entry. It's not alphabetized. So I met up with some Osage people last week, and they got a list, 5 pages by date of entry. But it was they were very proud of that document. So you can also search through, and there's a list. With the light in here, it's hard to say. But what you're going to do is just put in Carlisle Indian Industrial School Resource Center, and it'll come right up on the internet. And then you can start looking around and clicking on, various parts. Now, my research on the Crow students is what I'm going to start on now. And, I wanted very much, my questions were, who were these students? How old were they when they entered? Did they have any education? As they entered, what did they sign up for? What were they assigned in terms of vocational training? Did they get sick? Now, I had a whole set of maybe 20 questions, and so I opened individual student files to see what was in the file. And I have gradually come to know, and so this is that Crow Indian students. I'll try to pick up the pace here a bit. Remember that education was mandatory, and I probably already covered this. But I think the health conditions are really important. In this era, the Crow tribe was at its very lowest population. At its height, it's thought that the Crow tribe, let's go back to 1600, we had probably between 15,000 and maybe 25,000 Crow Indians. But in this era, in the year 1920 is the very lowest population count, 1,780. That's a population collapse. Nearly extinction. And in the time between 1890 and 1920, the Crow tribe, in 1890 it was 2,500, by 1920 it was 1,800. This is a lot of disease and death, just every day. And the population ages 0 to 18 dropped in number by half during that period. So whether you lived on the reservation or you were at boarding school, death was an everyday experience due to disease and malnutrition. I just say this because you can't just look at the boarding school in isolation. Really, it's important to understand the environment the children came from, and then the environment they went to. All right, let's see what these children looked like. If we were to go there in Crow Agency, these are girls in 1927. This is Max Bigman and his sons. A family with 2 children. Crow Indian family, 1910, and some little kids twirling around a pole. You probably did this when you were little too. My fascination is to try to become as close as I can to these students, to see their faces, maybe even to hear their voices narrating what they're experiencing. I might be looking for data, but really I'm looking for that. I really am. And I respect them for their life that they lived. The early schools serving the Crow Indians, I'll just go over this really quickly. Already the 3rd agency, that's in Crow Agency, Little Bighorn. Population, okay, Crow Agency boarding school right there in Crow Agency as we know it, also at Pryor, a boarding school. Montana Industrial School for Indians was near Custer, Montana, run by the Unitarians. It was a K-6. The St. Francis Xavier Catholic Boarding School in St. Xavier. The Baptist Day School in Lodgegrass, another entirely different story because they petitioned to have a day school, not a boarding school there. And then the off-reservation boarding school. So our children, there weren't even that many, were all signed up in these schools in a mandatory way. All right. In our reservation, these various schools were in all these locations. And our reservation is large. It's bigger than Rhode Island and smaller than Connecticut, but you're Montana people, you know how big it is. And you don't know how big Rhode Island is, I bet. Okay, here is a class, the class of 1897. There's 2 crows in this. In the 3rd row down, Upshaw and Shively. So Alexander Upshaw and Frank Shively are in here. And that relates to the upcoming program that is going to be offered. So here are our graduates. Okay, 97 students, 12 graduated. That means they finished that high school curriculum. And I'm going to read their names out of respect for them. I mean, we're all familiar with looking at lists, but I really want to hear their name. George Means, Carl Leader, George Suis. George Suis married my grandmother. Isn't that amazing? He came home with TB and he died. They didn't have children, so she remarried to Mr. Pease. Rest is history. George Suis, Louisa Geisdorf, William Layton, Joseph Martinez, Frank Shively, Alexander Upshaw, Charlotte Geisdorf, Rose LaForge, George Washington Hogan, the father of Mardell Hogan Plainfeather, who lives here in Billings, and Christine Childs. But we don't have lists of vocational certificates, even though they are noted in some individual files. Here's data on the Crow Indian Carlisle students. One of the first photographs I found, a whole assembly of Crow Indian students got a picture taken together. And the students would save their spending money and hire the photographer who had a studio at Carlisle, and they'd take pictures they wanted to take, not the school. So that's really very interesting. So they'd spend their money on photos. Irritated Captain Pratt very much because he didn't want the families to see them grouping together. So gender, 58 males, 38 females. Age of enrollment. This was a great curiosity to me. So by going through each file and their enrollment card, I got to figure out, but it's a process of subtraction, and you know how it goes. Okay, so there's one 7-year-old, one 9-year-old. See that, how those numbers work? 2 10-year-olds, 15 12-year-olds, 8 13-year-olds, 13 14-year-olds, 16 15-year-olds, 11 16-year-olds, 9 17-year-olds, 11 18-year-olds, 4 19-year-olds, 2 20-year-olds, 2 21-year-olds, and 1 22-year-old. So our agent at Crow really used this as a secondary, even post-secondary kind of educational opportunity. And another thing is, almost all of these people have already survived smallpox 2 or 3 times going through the community, which may have given them a little more immunity. Hello. Again, looking at agents sent groups of students. So in 1883, and that's from the second agency, that's at Graycliff. They got on the train at Graycliff in 1883 because the agency wasn't to Crow Agency until 84. So I think that's very interesting. Okay, so a group in 83, another group of 24 in 88, 19 in 1990, 9 in 98, and then the students entered with education. So Luther standing there talked about having his hair cut. Crow students already had that happen to them. Sorry. And there's sibling groups as well, Coopers, Stewarts, and Giesdorfs. Being the data gatherer that I am, I made a spreadsheet. And I put them in alphabetical order, even though in the record they come in the date of arrival. So if you're looking up there, you'll see in bold print are the graduates. Also in bold print are those who died. 3 Crow Indians died at Carlisle, 12 graduated. And then there are others. Now, a file might have one little card in it, or it might have 38 pages of paper. So it varies. So I have the name, dates of enrollment, the age when they entered, where they came from, the district, their home district and the reservation, and then their reason for discharge. And if you look at the reason for discharge, you'll see the second one, or the first one, died at Carlisle. That's Katie Helen Adams. And then the next one, runaway. Ill health, marriage, ill health, time expired. And the time was 3 to 5 years they got to be there. And when they got to the end of that, if they hadn't quite finished a program too bad, maybe they weren't progressing. So when you see time expired, it's like you have 5 years, now it's time to go home. Defection, timeout, ill health, and so on. All right, so here we have, I don't know if any of you are looking for any particular person. When I presented this at Crow, I mean, there's whole families come in to watch the one name come up, and they're going, there it is, there it is, there's Grandma. So, yeah, it's, I won't read all the names, but notice that Charles Fisher died at Carlisle, then the graduate, the Giesdorf sisters, and one person in a presentation said, that's a German name. Well, Giesdorf was a physician that came to the second agency, married a Crow Indian woman, and his children then went to Carlisle, his daughters, Giesdorfs. Indeed, he was German American. But the names that you see are sort of a random bunch of names. Yes, there might be the children of agency employees, but they could also have been assigned somewhere along the way. So you really can't look at the name and say, well, these don't look like Indians, because they certainly are. When you look at the enrollment cards, you're going to see their actual Indian name written down on some of the cards. So, for example, Kills with his brother, Tilly, first name, from Custer. Now, when they're from Custer, they came from the Montana Industrial School run by the Unitarians, about 5 miles south of Custer. And there were 11 students who were sent from Custer, from that Montana Indian Industrial School. Okay, let me point out. On the final column, there is what they are doing, farming, storekeeper. They surveyed the students, so they sent back a survey, and if it's there, and I can get an indication. So storekeeper, farming, academics, unknown, tailor, carpenter, ranching, storekeeper, housekeeper, unknown, seamstress, laundry, blacksmith. And laundry in these days was big business. There was an enormous laundry and crow agency for the school and the agency, so it was employment. All right. Oh, I'll note for you, number 76, George Suis. I already pointed out that he married my grandmother, but Carlisle actually sent their promising students to normal school. And if you're old enough, you know that normal school was a teacher training college. And there were 3 or 4 normal schools in Pennsylvania where Carlisle students went after they finished their academics, and Carlisle called it an outing. So they supported it. And so our normal school graduate, George Suis, you see over there on the right hand, normal school, he was planning to be a teacher. He finished a certificate for teaching. That's okay. We're all used to it. We wonder if it's ours. This fellow, Blake White Bear, 88, was in steam plant. It was called engineering. But you know how these institutions had gigantic steam plants to heat their buildings. And so that's what he was trained in. It was in high demand in those days. All right. Now, we talked about health problems. There were 17 students sent home for ill health, not because they had completed their term or because they had graduated. And I found from visiting with the archivist that when a student became ill enough, they put him on the train and sent him home. So 17 students were sent home with what was called scrofula. Scrofula, it's like an old term, probably symptoms leading to serious tuberculosis or something like that. So now I've also been able to dig into whether or not they deceased, which is likely, isn't it? Because if they had TB there and they came home, it would be a matter of how advanced they became. Some of the Carlisle students were actually sent to BIA sanitariums. There was a BIA sanitarium in Lapwai, Idaho, and there was another one in Iowa, and there was a sanitarium in Pennsylvania they'd send students to. But let's look here. And I like to read the names. Bear with me, because these people came home ill and many of them died. So out of respect, Lillian Otter Chief. She was discharged in 09 and deceased in 09 at Crow Agency. So this is an agent's note in their file saying when they deceased. Chloe Bad Baby, released in 87, deceased in 94. Lizzie Bergetsa, discharged in 95, deceased in 96. Charles Bravo, released in 90, deceased in 90. Charles Clausen, recovered. Samuel Davis, recovered. Edward Hears Fire, he recovered. Paul Jones, released in 84, deceased in 86. Kills with his brother, Tilly. She was discharged in 91 and she recovered. Helen Onion, discharged in 84, deceased in 95. And Flora Pretty Lodge, Fred Shane, Katrina Shane, recovered. Sarah Shavings, deceased, she lived for 9 years. Laura Schutze Lodge, and she recovered. George Suis, deceased in 05. And Nellie Wentworth. Now, Nellie Wentworth is an interesting person because she went to the Montana Industrial School, and the first teacher there was named Mrs. Wentworth. So she went and took that name, Wentworth. And many of her descendants actually use the name Wentworth. I remember hearing some people going by Wentworth, but they've changed back to Big Lake for the most part. Here is the cemetery as it was last week when I took this photo on the left. And there are a number of tribes who have repatriated the remains of their tribal members. Rosebud Sioux in South Dakota, Ogallala Lakota, the Northern Arapaho, and so there were long lines of stones. There are areas where there are no longer stones because of that. So Charles Fisher from Crow Agency was enrolled from 83 to 86, is in plot location A33. Katie Helen Adams from St. Xavier died at age 20. She was enrolled from 0 to 3. Her trade was housework. In plot location D24, she died of tuberculosis. Now, the research process, they have a list of all the illnesses in a quarter, so all of them by month, and then there's a list of illnesses, and there's only one death in November, and that was her. That was Katie Helen Adams. So she died of tuberculosis. Ernest Iron. Now this was a mystery because in the original data that I looked at, he died and was discharged on the same day. And that there's unknown markers. It just says unknown, no name or tribe or anything. And so we were kind of wondering if that person, Ernest Iron, who is a brother to my first cousin's grandfather. I mean, you know, the family has wondered. Okay, so while I was there, this mystery was solved. First of all, parents came to retrieve the body. They were called when he was ailing. Carlisle sent a telegram to the family saying he is dying. That's just what it said. And the parents got on the train and got there. Whether they got there to see their son alive or already gone, then they brought him back and he's buried at St. Xavier. So he's not an unknown at Carlisle. Yeah. Oh, we had marriages. There are 3 others that are just mentioned, and I'm going to be doing more research on those 3. But William White married Josephine Williams. Both were expelled from Carlisle. Having love affairs and getting married was against military regulation. William White enrolled in 99 to 05 in the trade of system engineer, and he was, when they came back, he was employed at Crow. If you've been to Crow Agency, you know that gigantic smokestack, and he ran that. Yeah, and he married Josephine Williams, who came to Carlisle from Sanchion, which is Salem School, which would be Chemawa, I believe. Rosa LaForge married Charles Dillon. They were both employed, and after they graduated, they were employed at Carlisle, and then they married, and then they left and had employment at Crow. Now, Charles Dillon, Rosa LaForge was enrolled from 98 to 05, graduated in 04, trade of seamstress, and she was employed as an assistant matron in the girls' dorm. And she married Charles Dillon, a Crow Creek Sioux from South Dakota. He was enrolled from 99 to 05 in the trade of blacksmith, and they are the great-grandparents now of an enormous Dillon family from Wyola. And they're the fans when I present this, pack the room with Dylans. And Julia Hawkes married Thomas Medicine Horse, both discharged due to marriage. They were, sent home. Julia Hawkes enrolled 98 to 02, trade of housework. And Thomas Medicine Horse Lower Brule Sioux enrolled in 98 to 02 in the trade of carpentry. And there is a large Medicine Crow family at Crow. On here's a few more things. Some of this I have mentioned. Students, there are 3 who took nurses training, and the school would pay for their room and board and the cost of their training through the outing system. So we have Susie Farwell, Margaret Pickett, and Ida Towns, who once she got done, and over here we have the Brooklyn, New York. She went there for nurses training and graduated there, and then she got placed in that Lapway Sanitarium. So she went from Carlisle to Lapway and practiced her nursing. Carlisle students who entered the service, there were 5: Hugh Leader, Horace Longbear, George Pease, my grandfather's younger brother, Russell Whitebear, and George White Fox. And Carlisle students who went to normal school, 5 of them, and they all became teachers. Charlotte Giesdorf, Louisa Giesdorf went to Sisseton, Wahpeton in South Dakota, Frank Kaiser, George Suis, who passed, and Alexander Upshaw, who went to Genoa, one of those off-reservation boarding schools in Nebraska. Okay? So I'm going to skip over that one. One of the mysteries I found was that there were 4 fellows who came from Fort Snelling. Fort Snelling is an army prison in Minnesota. And I know it's not a Crow reservation district. So I really had to start digging, and I called Fred Hoxie, and I talked to Adrian Heidenreich, people who know these things, you know. And now this is an example of what you'll find in the student file, a card like that, handwritten card. And there's things like when they entered and when they were discharged, their Indian name, perhaps the parent name, and so on. But it said District Fort Snelling. Well, it turns out that the rebellion that was called Wraps Up His Tail Rebellion at Crow, and that's a whole nother story. But there were several there were 7 that were arrested and sent to Fort Snelling, and 4 of them came to Carlisle from Fort Snelling and were students there. And so this actually represents about 20 hours of research and all kinds of books digging into the rebellion and what the names are, because they actually ended up changing some of their names when they enrolled at Carlisle, and I had to look at birth dates and all kinds of things. So one of those detective challenges, you know. So Moses, his cows, and Egbert B. Hale, his name is Big Hale, and over here, Julian Food, his name, Indian name was Carries His Food. And so that was an interesting find. But then this past week when I went there, I asked, what about these prisoners? Well, as you know, Captain Pratt brought prisoners from Fort Marion, from the Apache Comanche, Kiowa, Caddo, Cheyenne, and so on. And it turns out there are other groups of prisoners. We had 4 Crow prisoners from Fort Snelling from that rebellion, but he also recruited Nez Perce prisoners from where they were being held in a prison on the Ponca Indian Reservation in Oklahoma. And then also there were 10 Hopi prisoners brought to Carlisle Indian School. So he continued, the interaction with prisoners of war. It was just, an interesting kind of a segment of the student population. Now, this is a profile, and I'll just stop on a couple of these. But Alexander Upshaw graduated in '97. He was enrolled from '88 to '98. His father was Plenty Bear. So Upshaw. Somewhere he got that name Upshaw, but his father was Plenty Bear. He was scheduled on 5 outings. He graduated in '97. He was a published writer in the Carlisle Indian Helper, that's a student publication. He attended Bloomsburg Normal School, got a certificate for teaching. He was hired at Genoa, Nebraska as an industrial teacher, and he married another teacher there whose name is Emma Young. He's a political activist on the Crow Reservation, and he became an assistant to Edward S. Curtis, who took thousands of pictures of Native Americans all around the United States. His specialty was the Crow Indians, and he also helped with the Hidatsas of the three affiliated tribe in North Dakota. And if you read about Edward S. Curtis, there is a book on him called Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher. There's an entire chapter on this fellow. Yes?
Edward Curtis has some photos on display at Yellowstone Art Museum right now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for mentioning that. Curtis photos are amazing, but the role this fellow took was to recruit the people, to set things up, to understand the culture, and of course he was Crow, he spoke Crow, and so there's quite a narrative about how much he helped Curtis. Curtis actually writes about that. This is George Washington Hogan. He, at age 10, requested of the agent, his father went there to ask, may I go to Carlisle? He was denied, but by the time he was 16, he was able to become enrolled and go to Carlisle. He desired it from everything that he had ever heard about Carlisle men, people returning from Carlisle. Let's read a little more. His trade was tin shop. He's from Crow Agency. He was there from 98 to 04. His parents were Bear Before and Emma Shane Frazier. He married, and we can save that for another day. He was part of a group, and his daughter, Mardell Hogan, is an historian, accomplished and published, and lives here in Billings. And she wrote a paper on her father, and so this is a quote from that paper. He was a part of a group of young men who attempted to spread their wings of intellectual protection over matters of political importance to the Crow. They joined the chiefs with a weapon that the old chiefs did not have, a white man's education. The chiefs eventually learned to rely on them to convey their words to the whites, especially to the Great White Father. As interpreters, they worked for missionaries, anthropologists, local traders, and Crows themselves in matters that required reading, writing, and oratory skills. The term that was used for the Carlisle students, now graduates, returned to the Crow, were Carlisle men. And Carlisle men. So Chief Plentycoos was very, very reliant on the Carlisle men. And just some photos to see their faces. We have Mary Morrison. We have Martin Roundface with friend Albert Hensley, who I believe was Dakota, and Julia Cabell, who could have been from Blackfeet, you know, the big Cabell decision, the land buyback, Cabell. And Susie Farwell, she's one that went into nursing. Susie Farwell entered at age 14, and she was from that Montana Industrial School near Custer, trade nursing. And in the survey, now the student survey was really interesting because they narrate their life. It says, I have tried to live up to Carlisle teachings. I have married John Glenn for 13 years. We have 4 of the nicest children you ever saw. 2 girls and 2 boys. And of evenings, they love to sit around me, and we tell them of my school days at Carlisle. And their descendant is Daniel Glenn, a well-known, nationally famed architect. Designed the LBHC campus. This is a woman who actually is one of the prompts for me wanting to know more about Carlisle. Her name is Minnie Reed. Minnie Reed, and you can see her enrollment card. Minnie Reed founded, when she returned from Carlisle after getting vocational certificates, she founded the Crow Women's Federated Club. And this club had up to 40 members. She founded it in the late 20s, and it went right into the 60s. There was a chapter also in Wyola, and there were many Carlisle women alumni, that joined her in the Federated Club They cared about issues, home conditions, education, health, law enforcement, and inheritance problems. Club members formed the first PTA in Crow Agency. They advocated for 2 schoolboys who were beaten by teachers after they had been away because their grandmother had died. And they took up for her, or these boys wrote letters to Helena, and the Office of Public Instruction terminated the 2 teachers at Crow Agency on that account. This is a woman, a dynamite lady, a dynamo, I guess you might call her. I utterly and completely admire this woman. A little bit more about the Women's Federated Club, because she was joined by Susie Wallace, who was a Carlisle woman, Mary Shane One Goose. And so the Crow Indian Women's Federated Club organized a sewing club, and they got money from the tribe, but also other organizations here in Billings to sew clothing for the children in Crow School. She was elected to tribal secretary, and while she was secretary, she complained about useless discussions of buying Canadian horses to upgrade Crow steeds. That was what she wrote in her complaint. Tribal elder Deernose spoke out briefly in favor of their sewing club, and they were eventually given $1,000 in 1940. I think they had a sewing club every single year they were organized. They wanted to add women to the delegations to Washington, D.C. And I don't have it written up here, but she stood before the council and she said, "You men go to D.C. and parade around in feathers and buckskins and talk about horses. Well, our children are starving, there's bad water, and the adolescents are running wild in the alleys of Crow Agency." Yeah, she had a lot of gumption. She also wrote letters to just about everybody, probably even the Queen of England. Okay, we have Persis Big Hair. We have Richard Sanderville and William Lighton, who is the Crow, and John Frost. We have Joe Stewart and Albert Anderson and Theron Lears. Theron Lears is one of those Fort Snelling persons. And this is Carlisle Indian student George Hill, who became a staff member at the Montana Indian Industrial School near Custer from Carlisle. And that's a picture of the school. And then we have Frank Yarlett and a friend, George Pratt, Carlisle student Dick Wallace, who was there for 10 years. He went from the second agency and he stayed at Carlisle for 10 years. Carlisle Indian students Frank and Maggie Kaiser. And Kaiser was an agency employee who married a Crow Indian woman. And here's Russell Whitebear, just in brief. He was a politician, an activist, and he taught at the Pryor boarding school, hired from Carlisle. He is quite the outspoken orator on the floor of the Crow Tribal Council. Russell Whitebear. And here is Lois Pretty Scalp, who married Louis Bumpard, who is a boss farmer. And I just thought you'd like to hear what she wrote in that survey. Lois Pretty Scalp Bumpard responds, "We own our own home. It is white with 2 rooms and a porch. We have 50 chickens, 5 turkeys, 3 geese, 10 pigs, 7 doves, and 13 horses. I worked at the school as a laundress for 1 month. My husband, a full-blood, is a boss farmer. In every district, they had a boss farmer looking after the agriculture, and a boss farmer was really a powerful person in that district. My husband, a full-blood, is a boss farmer. We take a leading role. The agent relies on my husband." So we have Helen Onion, Hugh Leader, in 2 different pictures. And gosh, I can't even read that, sorry. And Frank Shively. Now you'll know more about this in future programming here, but Frank Shively is someone who needs to be noted. He was there from 90 to 97. His Indian name is Braided Scalp Lock, but he was the son of a person that was employed at the second agency who was killed in a raid along with his, I think his mother died in childbirth, so he was orphaned. He took his father's name even though he had the Indian name braided scalp lock. Okay, so the mother died in childbirth, there you go. Employed as a stenographer at Lapway. Now you all know where a Lapway is, it's near Lewiston, Idaho. Employed as a stenographer, but several days a week. Go on to the next item. He was employed as the first head football coach at Washington State Agricultural College, ever. So you know, Washington State University is a powerhouse when it comes to football, but Frank Shively was their first coach. And he coached in the seasons 88 and 89. And he was a political activist with Joe Cooper. And Frank Shively served as an interpreter for Chief Plentykoos. Chief Plentykoos entirely entrusted. He really worked with and totally appreciated Frank's talents. All right, and he's inducted in the Montana Indian Athletic Hall of Fame. He has many descendants on the Crow Reservation. And let's see, Carlisle Indian students. These are the Giesdorf sisters with Rosa LaForge. And we have 6 Crow Indian students who are not named. And then Carlisle Indian student Frank Shane with a friend. And Carlisle Indian students portrayed on the far right, David Hodgson and Joe Stewart and Thomas Stewart. So if you're into reading, here is my reference list. And I am sending a copy of this presentation to the Western Heritage Center. Thank you for coming, and good to see you. I just think you'll find it very compelling to study about the boarding schools. I will say that there are successes and there are tragedies. Certainly for the 3 students who lost their lives and the 17 who were sent home due to illness and then a short life thereafter. It's very tragic for them and their families. It's a bittersweet experience. It's not all one or the other. And it's something to, I think, all of the families who have Carlisle students in their family, they do take pride in it. And they understand that it's probably contributed in many ways to their strength, their resilience, who they are as a family, maybe even who they are in their achievements. So I'd just like to conclude by saying thank you very much for having me. Oh.